Welcome to Carnegie Politica podcast. My name is Alexander Gabuev. I'm director of the Carnegie Russia Eurasia Center in Berlin and the host. Today we're gonna talk about country that's in the news, unfortunately, mostly when something happens in the war in Ukraine, and it's not Russia, and it's not one of the partner countries of Ukraine that help Kiev to defend itself from the Russian aggression. It's Belarus, a country right to the west of Russia, one of the republics that emerged after the collapse of the Soviet Union, and a country that's been made into accomplice of Russian aggression because the Russian initial assault on Kiev and the north of Ukraine happened through Belarusian territory, although the troops of Belarus didn't support the Russian invasion. It's clear that Belarus and its leader, Alexander Lukashenko, are very much part of the Kremlin's warplane. Today, I'm very thrilled to talk to my colleague, Artyom Shraibman, who is a non resident senior fellow at Carnegie, one of the most prominent political analysts in Belarus, living now in Europe since 2021. Who had to leave the country after the violent crackdown of protests in 2020, and one of the most astute and clear-eyed observers of what's going on in Belarus and around. Welcome, Artyom.
Thank you.
I'm happy to have you. Uh, Let us start with a very general question that sounds a little bit strange to my ear, because if we would talk 5 years ago, it would be clear to me that Belarus is a separate country, that Russia, despite all of this visual camaraderie, sometimes between President Putin and President Lukashenko, has a very thorny relationship after all with Lukashenko regime. That Alexander Grigorievich doesn't make himself a very easy partner for the Kremlin. And when I still lived in Russia and talked to many senior officials, there are very few people in the post-Soviet space who cause this amount of allergy as Alexander Grigorievich, who has been around for quite some time. And after what happened in 2020, the violent crackdown of the protests and real tightening of the regime was bankrolled by massive Russian support. Uh, it increasingly appears to many observers that, well, is Belarus still a country? Can we talk about Belarusian autonomy? Is it an entity of its own? Or is it more something like a large Belarus federal district of Russia? What's your view?
Well, it is fair to say that Belarus's agency has been reduced since 2020, but especially since the beginning of the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, because Belarus was used as the springboard, and since then Russia has largely treated Belarusian territory as the extension of the Russian military planning, Russian military machine in a way, because Belarusian logistics, Belarusian airspace, Belarusian roads, Belarusian industry all have been utilized in this war in different stages of this war. Because it is also fair to say that this military alliance or using of Belarusian territory and Belarusian logistics have been uneven, because in the first couple of months, Belarus was simply a corridor for land invasion. Troops were marching back and forth through the territory of Belarus. Then, for about half a year, it was used for intensive missile shelling of Ukraine, and Russian Air Force were stationed in Belarus until early 2023. But after that, the conventional troops left. Russian conventional troops have left the country almost entirely by the mid 2023. But the Russian military presence has not sort of evaporated with them, because first these troops were sort of replaced with the part of the Wagner mercenary group, which just committed a mutiny, and for them Belarus was kind of a shelter, temporary base. And then the nuclear weapons also became deployed in the country. So it shows that Belarus has been used in whatever way Putin wants. And indeed, it leaves us with the question of how much agency is still left. And it's a philosophical question in a way, because, first of all, I think that this amount or volume of sovereignty, if you can describe it in these terms, is fluid. So Lukashenko has not changed. And if and when he is provided a historic opportunity to distance himself from Moscow to his benefit, he will undoubtedly do this. There is no doubt in my mind that he feels no enthusiasm or appetite to be part of the Russian war with the rest of the world. At the same time, he is currently not in this position because of the great systemic structural dependency that Belarus has found itself in economically, militarily, informationally, politically, especially after 2020, as you rightly said, when Putin effectively saved Lukashenko from the imminent overthrow, basically a revolution. I would say that the domestic politics of Belarus is still largely within the under the control of Lukashenko and his regime. So Russia does not seem to care that much about how Lukashenko governs his country, as long as it doesn't create any threats to the Russian interests. Foreign policy is pretty much aligned now with the Kremlin's. So it is the classic case of what is sometimes being described as a vassal state or a satellite state, very similar to many communist regimes of Cold War era, like Eastern Germany, Czechoslovakia, Romania, you name it. I mean, in different forms, Belarus repeats many of these experiences. Economy, as I've said, very tied to Russia. In military, the dependence is probably the biggest in military realm. But again, one should not underestimate the deeper, uh, deeper underlying differences in the strategic interests of two regimes. Because in the end, a Russian regime is about expansion, especially in the post-Soviet, let's say, Eastern European region. So Belarus and Ukraine are viewed in Kremlin as the historic abnormalities as separate countries. So in the end, there is this contradiction there, because Lukashenko, just as any other autocrat, would like to have his power being unchallenged from external forces as well, just as from the domestic forces. So this contradiction revealed itself many times in the past, and I'm pretty certain that it will reveal itself once again in future.
We talked about Lukashenko, which I think is justified since that's an autocratic regime. He's been around for quite some time. And the existence of Belarusian state and the rule of Lukashenko have kind of pretty similar timelines in a way, though he was not the founding father like President Nazarbayev in Kazakhstan. But what's interesting and important is how would you see the current Belarusian elite, particularly people in law enforcement, the civil servants, and the upper tier, whether the idea of Belarus as an independent actor, an independent state that at some point may even find opportunity to charter a different foreign policy course, at least, is there, and the population that still remains. Because a lot of intellectuals like yourself who were proponents of a separate, liberal, autonomous Belarus, not necessarily on bad terms with Russia, but more treating Russia as a neighbor rather than a big brother that bosses around in Belarus and kind of shapes its policy choices. A lot of these intellectuals are out. So, would you say that there are still agents of Belarusian autonomy and identity inside? Because for many people, I would assume, and you should excuse my naive Russian idea about that, but for many people who probably grow up speaking Russia, you are a 2 or 3 star general in Belarus, in KGB, for example. You are under Western sanctions. You have vacations in Sochi, Turkey, UAE. Your colleagues and best friends are in Russia. probably your kids are educated at Moscow State or MGIMO. So you think like, well, maybe if I just integrate into the big Russian imperial machine, like there is a lot of benefits for me as well. And like, why don't we become a region? Where is your view? Where do people sit? I know it's a kind of generalization, and we don't have a very good representative sample. But what is your sense, since you talk to many people in the country?
Well, we know more about the general public than about the ruling elite, obviously, and the general public sentiment have not changed that much since 2020. The available public opinion polls suggest that only a very, very tiny minority, a single digit minority of Belarusians would like to see a full merger with Russia or any kind of confederation with Russia. If you add upon this various other forms of unification like single currency or single army, well, then the percentage is slightly bigger, up to a third, but I mean, not a majority. The majority of Belarusians, even those who are sympathetic to what Russia does in the world, those who are ardent supporters of Vladimir Putin and watch Russian TV day and night, they are still in their majority support the separate Belarus, independent Belarus. So this is the result of more than 30 years of independence, which cannot be that easily rolled back in the people's conscience. People like to be living in the separate country, also because many of these people have their pro-Russianness comes from their Soviet sentiments and Soviet nostalgia in many of these people. And for them, Russia is not that perfect of a successor to the Soviet Union, actually. It's a country that is still illustrated with oligarchy, with corruption, with less welfare and state spending than Belarus. So for these people, Belarus is actually quite a better, successor for the Soviet Union that they are nostalgic about than modern Russia is. So for them, why bother merging with it if we have our small Soviet Union here at home? So it is a very, very narrow group of people who actually want to become part of Russia. At the same time, with the establishment, it is harder to say because I'm pretty sure that since 2020, the relative share of the people who think along the lines you've described, where they don't see a particular value in Belarusian sovereignty, I think that the share of these people has increased because Lukashenko has purged the elites of people who showed any kind of sentiments or who sort of seemed like they were reformers or pro-nationalist, pro-European. They were not even that, but they were at least having some of this, maybe words said by them. By them about them, and so the ruling elite was very much purged after 2020, and many overtly pro-Russian figures were elevated. At the same time, I still believe that for the majority of them, especially on the mid levels and especially also on the high levels, there is some value in having your own sovereign country because the moment you allow Russian capital, Russian military, Russian elites to rule the country, there will be certain sidelining of the local elites, so to say. Everybody saw what happened with the local elites in so-called Donetsk People's Republics and Luhansk People Republics after their first, semi-annexation by Russia since 2014. Many of them were purged. Not all of them found their place in the new order on these occupied territories. Same with Crimea. And also for Lukashenko, the situation is, in for his family, the situation is even clearer. Nobody would leave them, in power after any kind of a merger. And of course, if you have a more or less absolute power, why refuse? I mean, why would you cede any of this? So I wouldn't say that there is a critical mass of Belarusian elite members who would gladly give up the sovereignty. At the same time, I would also not expect much resistance from these people for Russia to come in forcefully and basically put an ultimatum whether you either with us peacefully or there are tanks on the streets. So I also don't see that kind of patriotism and readiness to resist like we saw in Ukraine, for example, in 2022. So this is a very post-Soviet kind of it is very similar. This elite, ruling elite in Belarus, I think, is very similar to what we saw in most of the Eastern Ukrainian regions before the war of 2022, and especially before 2014. So sympathetic to Russia, definitely Russian speaking, definitely don't see their lives, you know, somewhere, outside of union with Russia, but are not very eager to merge, to give up everything that they have.
I have very limited experience to talking to senior members of Ukrainian elite, like not the intellectuals and not our peers, but people who are really kind of top 10, top 15 oligarchs and senior officials. But my limited experience tells me that none of them wanted to be a bigger fish in absolute terms. Like you imagine yourself, red snapper turning into tuna in absolute terms in an ocean which is dominated by a giant shark called the Kremlin. So people realize that it's better to be smaller in absolute terms, but much bigger in relative terms when you have your own pond, when you have your own country. Because in Ukraine, there was all the time some balance of power between various groups, and this competition between them was, in a way, as much as Ukrainian hate oligarchy, also one of the very precarious and interesting layers that allowed Ukraine not to become the kind of more centralized and authoritarian regime. Where in Russia, no matter how wealthy you are, you can be destroyed by one phone call from the Kremlin.
Exactly. And after 2022 invasion, there is also an additional layer of appreciating having your own state, because there is a consensus in Belarusian society among the pro-democratic part of it, pro-Russian part of it, pro-authoritarian part of it, and I assume within the elites as well, especially within them actually, that we don't want to be part of this war, that we don't want to have our kids sent into the meat grinder. We don't want to fight with our neighbors, even if we sort of believe in all the Russian conspiracies about how Ukrainians are run by the American puppets. Even if we, are on board with most of the Russian ideas about the world, we still don't want to be in this war. And being inside of any kind of joint space, semi-state or confederation with Russia, would demand of these people to at least step up their participation in the war, right? And nobody wants it. So I would assume that with the start of the war, the understanding in Belarus that the separate path, the separate state has its value, has even increased, even among the most, anti-Western or conservative circles.
Um, I think that it's very hard to determine what the future is. We are in a definitely a lot will depend on how this phase of the war ends. And there are multiple moving pieces, including inside Ukraine and inside Russia and in the West. So it's a very dynamic situation. But over the medium to long term, definitely the future of Belarus will be to a large extent dependent by a constellation of factors. What happens in Russia with Vladimir Putin and his regime, whether the system that he managed to build survives him, and that's unclear. But one of the variable is obviously Western policy towards Belarus. And for now, we've seen a lot of inertia, and my impression is even confusion because, like, how do we treat Belarus? Is it a separate entity? Do we need a separate Belarus policy, or is it too late? Obviously, senior policymakers are preoccupied with helping Ukraine to defend itself and trying to constrain resources available to Vladimir Putin. So Russia is very much on their mind, and Belarus is a subset. You've just published a very interesting and thought provoking paper at Carnegie that is arguing for a smarter policy that the West could pursue. It's called Getting Off the Back Foot and Guiding Principles for a Proactive Western Strategy for Dealing with Belarus. Could you summarize what your recommendations are and why that's something that the West should look into?
Yeah, thank you. I think that we must first realize when we are getting normative, so to say, when we're trying to give recommendations to the Western decision makers. I think the good first step is to realize the limits of whatever the West can do now, even if it dedicated most of its energy to Belarus, which would not happen realistically. But if even if the political will were there, still Russia controls a great deal of the keys to Belarus's future right now. So a lot depends on what happens with Russia, with Russian regime, as you've said, with this war. At the same time, so I don't propose like silver bullets. So do this and Belarus will be democratized by Tuesday, or do that and in a couple of years we'll see Belarus in NATO or in the EU. Of course, this is simply untenable, and that is why I and that is why I opt for and mostly emphasize the long-term effects that any of Western actions vis-a-vis Belarus can have right now. And I suggest that the West should focus on creating incentives for future Belarus to move towards the desired outcome, and the desired outcome being the Belarus which has overcome its authoritarian Lukashenko period, and also the Belarus that is not that much dominated militarily and politically by Russia. I don't actually like stipulate what it should be, like a EU member state or a neutral state. It is for the future Belarusian elites and people to decide, but at least the West should invest, I think, in efforts and resources into making Belarus less dominated by Russia. So,
How would
yes,
you
yes,
do
yes.
that?
I think that the most important thing here is to create, to increase incentives for this Belarus, for the future Belarus. And one of these incentives, or one of the set of incentives, should be directed at the people of Belarus. I think the only reliable driver, future driver of this modernization of Belarusian regime, emancipation of the country, effectively, and it includes measures like enhancing mobility, not helping Belarusian and Russian regimes to isolate Belarusians from the West, so building more networks connections, logistical solutions, opening checkpoints instead of closing them, more accommodative visa policies, and so on and so forth, but also support for independent media as the ultimate infrastructure for democratization, because independent media needs to survive the current period of apathy and lack of hope, because they will be of high demand in the times of greater volatility. Secondly, I suggest that the West streamlines the issue of nuclear weapons in Belarus, or at least puts it into the agenda of its demands and set of demands to Russia. Not because Russia will listen, obviously. I don't for a moment believe that current Russian leadership will listen to this request demands as much as it listens to anything else. But this issue should not be forgotten, because Russian nuclear weapons is one of the biggest hooks or anchors that Russia currently has in terms of its long-term control over Belarus, and it will be a very constraining factor for the future Belarusian elites, if not removed from the Belarusian territory. So this, I think, should be seen as the part of the post-war post-war settlement process, where in any way the future Eastern European or European security order will be formed, the issue of Russian nuclear presence in Belarus should not be thought of as something separate. This should be a part of this process, and I think that the West and Ukraine has the full right to demand the withdrawal of Russian nuclear weapons after Belarus, and I laid the case in the paper why I think that this is the case. Thirdly, I think we need the West needs to keep as much as possible to keep the contacts with official Minsk, not because it helps to change minds in Minsk, but because, again, in the moment of greater volatility in future, when the relationship between Putin and Lukashenko, or future leaders of Russia and Belarus, will sour, the West need to have a channel of communication with Minsk that will not need restoration, that will demand years, to rebuild this basic diplomatic infrastructure. So I just want to have the channel open and be um, more vibrant in the times where it will be necessary. It includes diplomatic presence. It also includes speaking with Lukashenko sometimes when it's necessary, when there are practical things that he can deliver, like it happened with the release of several political prisoners, or temporary resolution of a migrant crisis at the borders of the Eastern European EU members in the 2021, when German Chancellor called Lukashenko, and so on and so forth. So occasional dialogue has its added value, and it doesn't lead to legitimization of Lukashenko, which is very important, as the practice has shown. Fourthly, I think that it is also important to have the more flexible sanctions policy. And this is a big recommendation. I dedicate several pages to it. So just very briefly, I think sanctions should be viewed not as a part of the landscape that is like here to stay, but more flexibly as a tool of policy, not as its purpose or objective. And therefore, sanctions against Belarus should return to its primary objective of at least trying to change behavior of the regime in Belarus. Until Lukashenko is uncomfortable in his relationship with Putin, I don't think that any amount of Western sanctions will do this. Therefore, imposing new sanctions or cutting the existing ones or lifting the existing ones will not fundamentally change the incentives for Lukashenko. But when the moment comes and Lukashenko is more desperate for opening or reopening the Western vector of his foreign policy, I think the West should be prepared for this moment. And it includes doing two things effectively. First of all, stepping up sanctions where it's necessary so that they are not easily circumvented, like with secondary sanctions, what the US is more effective in compared to the EU, like investigation of sanction circumvention, like something on which European Parliament has just recently moved ahead and adopted a criminal criminal responsibility for violating European sanctions. All good steps in the right direction. And also, on the other side of this flexibility argument, I think that we need some understanding, some kind of a roadmap of how these sanctions, at least partially, can be lifted in future, what exactly needs to be done. So that regime in Minsk knows that the path is theoretically open to lifting of the sanctions, what exactly it can do to start this process, that it doesn't require Lukashenko to hand himself in the prosecutors in Hague to be able to start that path, to at least concede something in order to get something in return. And I therefore advise to have this sort of green list of sanctions, the sanctions that can go first. And there are more details in the paper on how to approach what exact sanctions should get into this green list of limited restrictions that can be put on the negotiations table in future. I emphasize only in future, when Belarusian government is ready for substantive dialogue and real concessions. And finally, fifthly, it is a small bureaucratic recommendation to institutionalize the issue of Belarus in the Western capitals, to have special representatives or special envoys or ambassadors at large responsible for Belarus in the European bureaucracies, in Western bureaucracies, in Washington, in Brussels, in key European countries like Germany, in order to keep Belarus on agenda in the times where nothing much happens in the country, because this is one of the big problems that as long as Belarus does not produce causes to worry about this, bureaucrats and diplomats move on to other subjects, and the institutional memory gets lost. And then there is this change of generations in European cabinets and MFAs. And in the result, Lukashenko has quite a better institutional memory about the EU or the US than these two entities have about him. So it is good to have some dedicated people, agencies, institutions, positions that would actually do this actual coordination of Western policy and follow Belarus closer. This is basically a bureaucratic solution to a bureaucratic problem. That's pretty much it.
This sounds fascinating. I think very clear eyed and new to me. My final question to you is living in Europe, we discover how complicated the animal called Western sanctions policy really is. And how much when people assume that, oh, it's guided by a strategy, there are some wise sages coming together in a tower and, having various scenarios mapped up, all the data is fused, aided by AI probably, and that results in a kind of sanctions policy. The reality is very different, and there is a lot of kind of national lobbying, emotions. Various players play various role at different timelines, and that results in not something that's optimal. And I give you one example with the sanctions against Russia. In my private conversation with senior investor officials, people don't question the logic of the sanctions or don't say that they had all outsized expectations, but they say like, oh well, some measures really turned out to be counterproductive. But because of the level of emotionality and because there is no positive change in Russia's behavior, things are getting worse. Undoing those sanctions that might actually help to weaken Vladimir Putin's regime, for example, and allow better flight of capital from Russia or human capital, that's impossible to do. And there are certain constituencies, particularly in Europe's eastern flank and the Ukrainian community, that would be really up in arms if that happened. So it's probably pragmatically smart to do, and people would admit, but it's just politically impossible. So nobody would even talk about that. Where do you see discussion about Belarus? Because to me, Belarus seems to be a little bit less toxic as a discussion for kind of moderation or change adjustment of sanctions policy and policy overall. Do you see room for that in Europe?
No, you are right that the situation with the sanctions, is very rigid in terms of people and governments sometimes putting very different set of goals behind the sanctions that I think would be reasonable to put behind them. And many of the sanctions actually are done sometimes for the pure, let's be honest, virtue signaling for the domestic audiences and have nothing to do with effectiveness or measurement of their effectiveness. And the same happens with Belarus, unfortunately. Many of the recent restrictions concern actually the mobility of Belarusians, the thing that I call to enhance, like closing checkpoints at the border and so on and so forth. And obviously, Belarus is under this air blockade, aviation blockade since 2021 after Lukashenko, uh, ordered to land commercial air flight flying over Belarus to just arrest a dissident. But the problem with sanctions that you've described in the Russian case is pretty relevant for Belarus as well, and it also complicated by the fact that not every country in the West still views Belarus as a separate entity that is worth its, its separate sanctions policy. That's exactly why I argue in the paper that there is the air between the two regimes still, and in future, the space between the two and the divergence between them is, first of all, very likely to appear, but also is the chance for the whole region to get this two decoupled. And that is why the differentiation is necessary in sanctions policy. But this is not clear to all the stakeholders and decision makers in the West. Also, not all of them believe that. Some, I think, in some cases, there is still this belief that sanctions can. It is within the toolkit of the Western governments to sufficiently strangle Belarusian economy, and that in the end it will give its results in this form or the other. So it's just the issue of just not enough sanctions still there, which also is hard for me to justify and to explain because uh, Russia has shown its eagerness to support Belarusian regime as long as it is, loyal. So there are these additional problems which uh, very they actually make the discussion about sanctions flexibility more complicated even than in the case of Russia. At the same time, my argument is that this moment of some kind of normalization between Minsk and the West will come. It will come, I mean, eventually. It may take a decade or it may take years. We don't know how much it takes, but it will come sooner or later. These two gentlemen in Kremlin and in Minsk, they are pretty senior. So in the end, there will be change, some kind of a change in two countries. I just argue for preparation. I understand that calling upon the West to modify its existing sanctions policies to, I don't know, separate sanctions here and now, Belarusian sanctions from Russian sanctions, uncouple this two sanctions regime, is unrealistic. Nobody will do it right now. What I ask for is preparation for the inevitable moment when Lukashenko or his successors will be in more need of the Western, dialogue with the West or cooperation with the West compared to where they are now. But currently, yes, the sanctions policy seems to be not just inflexible, but it sometimes seems like a new normal to which it is easier to adapt than to adapt this sanctions policy to actual reality. So this is how it's often viewed, and bureaucratically, it is easily explainable in a way. I can explain why it happens this way, but still, if we putting off our analyst's hat and sometimes want to become this, voluntary advisors, we still want to move to push the policy into the right direction. That's exactly why I, while being skeptical of the Western or generally government's ability to take on board this kind of recommendations, I still make them.
Thank you so much for being active in trying to push the envelope of both the analytical discussion and the policy discussion. Uh, Thank you so much for being here today, Artyom Shraibman, and we will have you back.
Thank you.
I very much urge everybody to read Artyom's paper. That's on Carnegie's website. It's very entertaining and very easily digestible. And thank you so much for listening. We'll be back.